Paul McCartney has always been known as the most beloved member of the Beatles. He is one of the most beloved figures in the music industry, known for his charm and positive energy. Regardless, he had rivalries and industry feuds, but he barely addressed them in public. Finally, he decided he was done deflecting from conversations, highlighting his hurtful experiences with 5 rock stars. Who could they be? Paul McCartney, a living legend, was born in 1942 in Liverpool. Right from the beginning, everyone could notice that he was not meant for an ordinary life. As a teenager, he taught himself to play the piano and the guitar. His father was a jazz musician, and thus the sounds of Little Richard and Buddy Holly rubbed off on him, making him realize that he cared about music more than he realized. He found his dream early on, and it was music. With that knowledge, he was unstoppable. At the early age of 15, Paul was already part of a group called the Quarrymen. John Lennon founded the group, and it soon evolved into a local band. What started as a teenage pastime in 1957 became what we now know and love, the Beatles. This music group threw the young men into the spotlight almost immediately. Often dubbed the cute Beatle, Paul brought more than boyish charm to the group. His melodic bass playing, versatile tenor voice, and gift for crafting unforgettable melodies made him the perfect creative partner to John Lennon's edgier style. As the Beatles grew more popular, so did Paul's ambitions. He always threw himself into the creative scene to draw inspiration and brought these ideas into the studio. He was responsible for the ideas that birthed albums like Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1967. He was ahead of his time because he knew all the seamless ways to incorporate pop elements and creative storytelling into his songs. When the Beatles disbanded, Paul didn't retreat. Instead, he channeled his creativity into new ventures. He founded Wings with his beloved first wife, Linda, and friend, Denny Laine. Under his leadership, the music band soared through the 1970s with hits like Band on the Run and Silly Love Songs. They eventually separated in 1981. Today, with 32 #1 hits to his name, multiple Grammy Awards, and a knighthood for his services to music, Sir Paul McCartney stands as one of the wealthiest and most respected musicians in the world. Yet, despite his estimated fortune of £1 billion and numerous accolades, he remains that young unknowing teenager from Liverpool who had an intense love for music. Paul is known for his humility and kind heart. But what happens when he is constantly disappointed and betrayed by friends and those perceived as his brothers? Paul rarely shared his disappointments or letdowns with colleagues in the industry. He only took it in good stride. This time he was done acting like he wasn't hurt. Here are 5 people whom Paul admitted that he couldn't stand. 1. Eric Clapton. This rock legend was born on March 30, 1945 in England. He perhaps never thought he would grow up to become one of the most revered guitarists in music history. Known as Slow Hand by his fans, Eric earned his nickname for his deliberate, soulful approach to playing the guitar. He was with the Yardbirds from 1963 to 1965. The experience was good, but Eric was restless. He wanted more out of his music career. He wanted to create a pure blues sound that spoke to him. In the late 60s, he created the powerful music trio Cream alongside drummer Ginger Baker and bassist Jack Bruce. Clapton crafted sustained blues improvisations that redefined the possibilities of rock music. The group eventually broke up, but not before creating 4 groundbreaking albums. Throughout the 70s, his career continued on an upward spiral, and Paul McCartney couldn't help but admire his talent and attention to detail. Recognition followed throughout his career. Rolling Stone ranked him second on their list of the 100 greatest guitarists of all time, while Gibson placed him 4th in their top 50 guitarists of all time. Time magazine named him number 5 in the 10 best electric guitar players in 2009. His collected 18 Grammy Awards, received a CBE, Commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire for Music Services in 2004, and holds the unique distinction of being the only person inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame 3 times, once as a solo artist and separately as a member of both the Yardbirds and Cream. Eric and Paul met a couple of times before. Paul had been in the studio a few times when Eric was making music. It was safe to say that they were allies in the industry. At least Paul thought they were until he left the Beatles to carve out a life for himself after their separation. Whenever Paul invited him out or tried to collaborate with him on multiple occasions, it began to look like their alliance was only a figment of Paul's imagination. In the 1970s, Paul approached Eric with the idea of creating a music group that combined the Beatles' history with blues magic. It was a solid proposal, but Eric Clapton never responded. The final straw that broke the camel's back was in 1992 at George Harrison's tribute concert. Paul was hoping to reunite with Eric Clapton and some members of the Beatles to sing one last hit together. Eric helped organize the guest list, but surprisingly, he placed Paul last on it. Allegedly, he instructed the organizers not to make the event a Beatles reunion. Some fans thought the statement angered him. Paul corrected that notion, saying it wasn't about ego, it was about respect. Truly, someone who respected him would not try to sabotage him. 2. Mick Jagger. Mick Jagger was born as Michael Philip Jagger on July 26, 1943. He entered the world in the small town of Dartford. And although the neighborhood was generally quiet and unassuming, Mick was going to be anything but quiet. He was going to grow to become a rebel and rock royalty. Ironically, his journey began at the London School of Economics, where he traded his economics textbooks for a microphone. He partnered with Keith Richards, and together they created a discography that has had a lasting impact on music history. Keith was his schoolmate, and they both discovered their love for music, eventually creating one of the greatest rock bands in history, the Rolling Stones. They didn't just write songs that broke charts, they made anthems that marked generations. Mick was not just one kind of creative. He was a ball of talent. His creative energy led him to make movies in the early 70s. He created films like Performance and Ned Kelly. But critics weren't always pleased when a man already successful in music tried to make a name for himself in film as well. He founded the production company Jagged Films and formed a music supergroup called Super Heavy. Around the time when the Rolling Stones were making a big impact in the music charts and at clubs, the Beatles also dominated their audience with groundbreaking records like Here Comes the Sun, Let It Be, and Come Together. Both bands were formed in the early 1960s. After all, during this period, fans chose camps between the two bands. A rivalry began to emerge, and it seemed that this fan rivalry would cause bad blood between the two groups. However, every time Paul McCartney was interviewed and asked about the rivalry, he laughed it off as something only the fans tried to project to the fans. The bands were battling for the crown of British rock, he claimed. We laughed during interviews. We would laugh about it and pretend it was a friendly competition. They were indeed friendly with each other. That was the only way the Rolling Stones could have gotten the song I Wanna Be Your Man. Paul McCartney gave them the song in a spirit of goodwill. Little did he know that Mick Jagger was not the ally Paul took him for. In an interview, Paul praised the Rolling Stones, describing them as a proper band. Things got tricky when the popularity of the Stones began to grow. It seemed like Mick's demeanor toward Paul was beginning to change. In the 1970s, Mick informed a writer that the Beatles were only a pop band and the Rolling Stones were the real deal. Pop at the time sounded like music for teenagers. It wasn't a genre of music that was regarded with much respect. With time, it was becoming clear that Mick was two-faced. He hung out with Paul only when it benefited him and made collaborations when it felt convenient. To the public, he pretended to be this bad boy who was in an active rivalry with the Beatles. His public stance only added fuel to the fire, inciting the fans even more. This in turn pushed album sales. It was the perfect hoax, but it came at the cost of Paul's trust. In a 2004 Rolling Stone interview, Mick was asked whether the Beatles deserved their reputation as the greatest band of all time. His response was, "They certainly were not a great live band. Maybe they were in the days of the Cavern when they were coming up as a club band. I'm sure they were hilariously funny and all that." It appeared to be a light-hearted jab, but it struck Paul regardless. He never gave a direct rebuttal, but he sent his own light-hearted jabs back in interviews later. When asked if he was open to collaborating with the Beatles, he said, "One Beatles reunion is enough for a lifetime." The statement carried animosity beneath it, and Paul was quick to spot it. He was hurt, and he wasn't ashamed to admit to feeling vulnerable about it. When describing his relationship with Mick, Paul said, "Mick is a showman, a brilliant one. But for me, it is difficult to trust someone who wants to be your rival, fan, or your replacement, depending on the audience." Paul now understood that most of the time, people in Hollywood were intentional about everything they did. If it wasn't going to benefit their careers, there was no need to put on a saintly act. This was only the second name Paul mentioned. There were three more. 3. Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan is a St. Louis County native. He was born as Robert Allen Zimmerman on a spring day in 1941. At 20, young Zimmerman packed his dreams and headed to New York City in 1961, chasing the promise of a successful music career. He legally changed his name to Robert Dylan, claiming that he didn't like the name he was born with and felt that he needed a new identity to start his music career. What followed was nothing short of revolutionary. Dylan's journey began with traditional folk and blues on his 1962 debut album, but by 1963, he found his voice with the freewheelin' Bob Dylan. Songs like Blowin', In the Wind and The Times They Are A-Changin' captured a radical energy that became the soundtrack to a generation demanding change. These weren't just songs, they were cries for civil rights and peace. Then came the Great Betrayal. Bob was done with folk music and all the radical messages. His fans, accustomed only to his old sound, were torn between sticking with Bob's new phase or searching for another artist with a similar message. In 1965 and 66, Bob traded his acoustic guitar for electric rock instrumentals. The folk community felt abandoned, but he was busy expanding the range of pop music. His 6-minute epic, Like a Rolling Stone, changed the rules for radio-friendly songs and proved that audiences were hungry for something deeper. It topped the charts faster than snow came around in December. A mysterious motorcycle crash in July 1966 changed the successful trajectory of his career. This put a pause on his career due to the injuries he acquired from the tragic accident. Bob put away touring for 7 years. During this hermit period, he collaborated with the band formerly known as the Hawks. Together, they created the Basement Tapes, John Wesley Harding, and Nashville Skyline. These projects made a mark on music history. Bob Dylan has sold more than 125 million records worldwide, been inducted into multiple halls of fame, and received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. However, most remarkably, he has never stopped performing. His love for the craft shines brightly through his dedication. His never-ending tour has kept him on the road since the late 1980s. An 84-year-old still chasing the thrill of songwriting and performing. Beyond music, Bob has revealed himself as a visual artist and sculptor, publishing 9 books of paintings and drawings since 1964. His life has inspired countless documentaries and even a 2024 biopic, A Complete Unknown. If Bob Dylan had this lovely, bubbly, creative personality, Paul McCartney would not have been fortunate enough to experience that part of him. Paul, when speaking about Bob, once disclosed, "I did not expect Dylan to be easy, but I did not expect him to be cruel either." Paul McCartney organized a covert peace summit to raise awareness and pressure political leaders to disarm nuclear weapons. He reached out to several artists personally, including Bob Dylan. They had met before and every interaction they had sounded good-natured and light-hearted. However, Paul McCartney noticed something amiss with Bob Dylan's attitude toward him. Whenever Paul wanted to collaborate with Bob, he would always stall. He disappeared. His response to Paul's invitation to the peace summit was silence. He eventually responded to Paul, but it wasn't the response he had hoped for. "I do not conduct sing-alongs for politicians. You are turning protests into products." The response hurt Paul. It made him feel like he was chasing a cause solely for his benefit or for clout. Allegedly, Paul responded that Bob's words made him feel like a schoolboy trying to impress his teacher with finger paint. It was a situation that came as a surprise to Paul because he had never had altercations with Bob Dylan. They always seemed friendly whenever they were together. There was a point when Paul realized that he did not have a friend in Bob. In a radio interview, when asked about the peace efforts made by other artists, Bob referred to these efforts as performance art for rockers. It was quite disappointing for Paul that Bob did not think their efforts would make a difference in the world. 4. David Bowie. David Bowie was born in 1947 as David Robert Jones. He grew up in post-war England and was drawn to art, music, and design as a boy. He spent his young age absorbing everything creative he could access. At just 16, David took his first bold leap into the music world in 1963. What followed was a series of false starts that could have crushed his spirit, string after string of unsuccessful singles with local bands, a solo album in 1967 that barely made a ripple, and the constant struggle of an artist trying to find his voice. It was hard for him to create a reputation for himself in the industry. But David Bowie possessed something rare, a belief that reinvention was not just possible, but necessary. In 1969, he released Space Oddity, which cracked the walls of the UK top 5. The success did not push him to become more open to fame. He disappeared for 3 years and returned as an entity reinvented to fit David's true identity. He re-emerged as the flamboyant, androgynous alter ego, Ziggy Stardust. Ziggy represented a rock star who broke the convention set up for the average artist. Ziggy wasn't just an alter ego. He was a fever dream wrapped in glitter and platform boots. The 1972 album, The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars didn't just make David famous, it made him mythical. However, true to his nature, just as audiences fell in love with Ziggy, David killed him off and moved on. The mid-70s brought another dramatic shift. David began to explore a sound he referred to as plastic soul. This sound confused his British fans, but it was the golden key to unlocking the doors for his American audience. This was a sign of his commercial success. David packed up and moved to Berlin in the late 70s, collaborating with Brian Eno on a trilogy of albums that pushed electronic music into uncharted territory. The 80s brought David his greatest commercial triumph with Let's Dance in 1983. But even massive success couldn't change his restlessness. He was always ready to try something new, something that challenged his creativity and imagination. He formed the hard rock band Tin Machine, explored industrial and jungle music, and seamlessly transitioned between recording studios and movie sets. After decades of constant touring and recording, David stepped back from live performance after 2004. Many assumed he was retiring, but he was simply entering another phase. After a decade of silence, he surprised the world with The Next Day in 2013, proving that his creative fire still burned bright. His final act was the most touching. Fans around the world went gaga when they realized it was going to be his final musical project. Black Star was released just 2 days before his demise on January 10, 2016. It was David's carefully crafted farewell. It sounded like an ode to his end. With over 100 million records sold worldwide, 6 Grammy Awards, and a permanent place in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, David Bowie's legacy extends far beyond mere numbers. He gave the world permission to change, to experiment, to fail spectacularly, and to try again. Although he was a gem in the music industry and left a glistening legacy, Paul McCartney mentioned him as one of the people he had a fallout with. David Bowie may have been a sweetheart in the hearts of his fans, but to Paul, he was just another snob. They both admired each other from a distance. They even frequently crossed paths. But whenever Paul sought something more official than a high five and a bye conversation, he disappeared. In the early 1990s, Paul had an idea for a concept album featuring artists from different genres of music. He invited David Bowie, but Bowie dismissed the invitation by giving no response. Through a friend, Paul heard that David called the event McCartney's retirement fantasy. Paul described David as too complex to like and too wonderful to ignore. He claimed he was the friend he never had because David never really allowed him to build a solid friendship. David Bowie may have passed away before anything could blossom between them, but Paul was deeply disappointed that he had lost that chance before he could even fight for it. 5. John Lennon. John Winston Ono Lennon was born in Liverpool on October 9, 1940. John was a child born during a time of war, and this might have sparked the rebellion that reared its head every time he wanted to express his creativity. In 1956, a skiffle craze was spreading through Britain. During this period, John put together a few boys from his high school to form the Quarrymen. When the Beatles emerged in 1960, Lennon naturally took the reins as their leader, though he gradually watched that role shift to his songwriting partner Paul McCartney. Together they created what remains the most successful songwriting partnership ever recorded. John had a successful career during his lifetime. He had 25 #1 singles, a Grammy Award for Album of the Year for Double Fantasy, and induction into the Songwriters Hall of Fame and Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice. Rolling Stone ranked him the 5th greatest singer of all time, while the BBC's poll of the 100 Greatest Britons placed him 8th. Regardless of his tragic passing and the flashy accolades, Paul McCartney had something to say about the Beatle who was like a brother to him. Paul described John as his best pal. However, things never remained the same after the dissolution of the Beatles. Allegedly, John conducted scathing interviews, snide lyrics, and insults veiled in peace anthems. People claimed that the 1971 John Lennon song, How Do You Sleep, was referring to Paul. The lyrics read, "The only thing you done was yesterday, and since you're gone, you're just another day." Perhaps the separation created a rift too wide to mend. John and Paul sounded as though they were hurting deeply inside. They eventually reconciled, but not long after John was murdered. Their relationship was perfect until the separation, but Paul never stopped having love for John in his heart. The Beatles. The term the Beatles has recurred so often that one might think it was a group of actual Beatles. But to those who were in their prime during the 1960s or those who know their music history, they would know that the Beatles consisted of some of the greatest musicians in the history of rock and roll. John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and eventually Ringo Starr didn't just form a band, they formed the Beatles. They created a cultural phenomenon. Their story begins like a Hollywood coming-of-age story. Teenage friends hanging out together, dreaming of something bigger. The early days of the Beatles weren't glamorous. They gravelled and suffered to perform in the smoky clubs of Liverpool and Hamburg, Germany. They built their stage presence one sweaty gig at a time. Stuart Sutcliffe initially played bass, but it was the arrival of Ringo Starr in 1962 that finally completed the puzzle. Manager Brian Epstein saw their potential and polished their rough edges. While producer George Martin became their creative collaborator, he helped them transform their written songs into chart-topping records. Their first hit, Love Me Do, arrived in late 1962, but nothing could have prepared them for what came next. By early 1964, Beatlemania created such an intense reaction from the fans that the Beatles became global sensations almost overnight. They were affectionately referred to as the Fab Four. However, fame came with a price. The constant touring became exhausting. The screaming crowds made it impossible to hear themselves play, and the pressures of fame began to take their toll. In 1966, they made the bold decision to stop performing live altogether, retreating to the studio to create music they loved. During this period, the group members grew and began to find their distinct voices. After a couple of innovative releases, the group separated. The pressures, creative differences, and personal responsibilities were beginning to place them on different paths, and it hindered their success as a group. Although the band members remained on relatively good terms. In 1980, they lost John Lennon. Following that loss, George Harrison lost his life to lung cancer in 2001. Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr continue to uphold the Beatles' legacy, performing whenever they wish. Their accolades as the Beatles are numerous. The group boasts 8 Grammy Awards for Brit Awards, an Academy Award, and induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in their very first year of eligibility. Time magazine named them among the 20th century's 100 most important people, and Rolling Stone has repeatedly crowned them the greatest artists in history. Although the Beatles have suffered a few tragedies, Paul McCartney and these 3 young boys saw a dream, chased it, and lived their dreams till the end of their lives. Regardless of the disappointments that may have come up along the way during their careers, it was only experience that prepared them for crucial life lessons. What do you think about these rock legends and Paul McCartney's revelations? Share your thoughts in the comment section. If you enjoyed this video, like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Before you go, watch the other videos on your screen.